Welcome to our finale of the graduation of Jake Moon, through all the ups and downs in the story and all of the trials and tribulations that Jake and his family have gone through, especially with Skelly getting lost. At the end of our last part, he was found, he was brought back by a cab driver, and that's where we pick up as we finish the graduation of Jake Moon. Let's get right to our hopefully happy ending. So Skelly was home. We whooped it up like you wouldn't believe, laughing and hollering and jumping all around in the street. Skelly seemed kind of confused by all the attention, but when his eyes finally focused on my mother, his whole face lit up. "Hello, you sweetie pie," he said. Ma put her arms around him and held on tight. He was sweaty and dirty, and his face was full of gray whiskers from not having shaved for a few days. But to me, he never looked greater. The cab driver, whose name turned out to be Campbell Burns, stood back and watched it all happen. He was patient and quiet, but when the celebration finally ended and Ma invited him inside, he sat down and told us what he knew. He was stopped at a light in a not-so-good part of the city when a grocery cart came rolling off the sidewalk and almost sideswiped his cab. "Well, at first, I thought it rolled off the curb by itself. But when I pulled over to get it out of the street, this nice old gentleman came around the corner, stepped down off the curb, and started pushing it." Campbell shook his head. "Luckily, it wasn't a busy street. He was down there near some old abandoned warehouses, so I figured he was probably a homeless guy. But when I got back in my cab, there was just something about him that didn't add up. For one thing, it's a pretty decent haircut he's got there. And his shoes were so clean they looked almost new. Also, most homeless guys I've seen don't push around shopping carts that are completely empty. So I decided to go over and talk to him a minute. That's when I spotted his ID necklace with this address on it." He smiled a little. "Got kind of stubborn, though, when I tried to get him in the cab. Wouldn't come without that darn card of his, so I figured what the heck, and I tied it to the roof." At this point, Mrs. Russell became so overwhelmed with gratitude that she rushed to his chair and hugged his neck. "Oh, God love you, Candle Burns." Ma pulled her off the best she could. "Campbell," she said. "His name is Campbell, Alma, not Candle." "Why?" squealed Mrs. Russell. "Is he full of soup? Ha!" Campbell grinned again and said he had to get back to work. I went back outside to help him get the grocery cart off of his car. Stalled around a minute and then finally came out with it. "Campbell, you think he's okay, don't you?" "Okay?" "Yeah, I know he needs a shower and a shave and all. But besides that kind of stuff, you think Skelly's, okay, right? You don't think anyone hurt him?" Campbell stopped what he was doing and looked down at me. "Well, if you ask me, he should definitely get checked out by a doctor, but from what I saw, your grandpop seemed to be in pretty decent shape. In fact, until we had that little problem about him not leaving his cart behind, he didn't even seem like he was in a particularly bad mood." As we were talking, Campbell Burns glanced in the back window of his cab. Then he opened the door and reached inside again. "Hey, I'll tell you one good thing, though, kid. Wherever he wandered off to, he must have run into a kind soul along the way, 'cause someone saw to it that he had water." He handed me a large plastic bottle. I gave him some more, but he drank it on the way home. When I came inside, I stood the empty bottle on my grandfather's nightstand. As a memento, I guess you'd call it. Before he went to bed that night, he filled it with water and put it in his closet next to all the soup cans. We put the grocery cart in his room. We're not going to leave it there forever, Ma says we're just going to put it there for a while. For 3 days after he got home, Skelly slept all night and napped all day. And in between all the sleeping and napping, my mother fixed all his favorite meals. On Monday, Dr. Bloomfield said he checked out fine. To me, though, one of the most surprising things about Skelly's great adventure was how fast our family went back to our usual routines. After an ordeal like that, you'd think that a family would be changed in some huge drastic way. Like everyone would go around humming and smiling and appreciating all the little things in life, for instance. And you'd especially think that the very next Sunday at family night dinner, the cousin who is in high school would not stick his thumb in another family member's mashed potatoes. Only he did. And even though James didn't lick his thumb first this time, I still don't consider that a monumental leap in our relationship. I have to admit, though, there was one thing that James did that night that shocked me like you wouldn't believe. After dinner, when Aunt Margaret got my grandfather ready for his walk, James went into Skelly's room and came out with the grocery cart. He said he thought Skelly might like to take it for a spin. Right away, Aunt Margaret started shaking her head. "Oh, no, we're not taking that cart with us, James. No way." But James just smiled and said, "Way." And before she could give him another argument, he carried the cart down the front porch steps to the sidewalk. He and Skelly started to push. And for the first time ever, I sat on the front steps and just waited for them to come back. I was sure that James would never go through with it. I mean, in spite of his many personality disorders, James has always been popular at school. So I was positive that as soon as he got on a busy street, it would occur to him that he looked like a total dork and he'd bail. But as amazing as this sounds, 30 minutes later, when they came around the corner again, James was still walking next to Skelly, pushing that cart like it was the most natural thing in the world. So that's how my family was changed by my grandfather's ordeal, I guess. Not in huge drastic ways, not even in our relationships with one another, but in personal little ways that didn't make much noise. As for me, before he got lost, I had pretty much made up my mind that I was not inviting Skelly to graduation, especially not after the restaurant incident. The risk just seemed too big. But on the afternoon that Campbell Burns brought him home, I sat on the edge of his bed as he was lying down for a nap, and I put an invitation in his hand. He looked at the front, then turned it over. "What's this?" "It's an invitation to my graduation, Skel. I want you to come, okay? I mean, it's pretty important for you to be there, don't you think? Even if you don't remember, at least I'll always know that you saw me get my diploma." Skelly examined it again. "What's this?" he asked. I just stood up and smiled. "Oh, no, you don't. You can't get out of it that easy. You're coming, Skel. Next Saturday night, you've got a date to my graduation, okay?" He nodded. "Excellent." I hugged him for a second, then left. When I got to the hall, I heard him mumble, "What's this?" A few weeks later, graduation was at 7 o'clock that Saturday night in the school gym. On Friday afternoon, the gym had still looked like a gym. I mean, the stage had been set up so we could practice going up and getting our diplomas and all. But the teachers and custodians weren't even close to having everything ready. Behind the stage, half of a banner was partially tacked to the gym wall. If you turned your head sideways, you could read the slogan, which was the theme, I guess you'd call it. It said, "Climb the learning ladder of success. Read, read, read." All that morning, teachers had kept trying to balance tall piles of books on top of these brightly colored red and yellow ladders. But the first time someone clomped too heavily across the stage, the books had come crashing to the floor. In between the crashing books, the custodians were pulling out the bleachers on each side of the gym for the audience and setting up chairs for the graduates who would sit in the middle. Since my class has more than 500 kids in it, we'd spend almost half a day on Thursday just trying to line ourselves up in alphabetical order. It's amazing how complicated the ABCs can get when 500 eighth graders are involved. Finally, one of the teachers got so frustrated, she made everyone memorize the names of the two people directly in front of us and the two people directly behind us in line. Then all day long, she would suddenly turn and point to kids at random, and they'd have to yell out the names of their group in order. Like every few minutes, you'd hear some poor kid shouting, "Farkle, Farley, Farnsey, Faro, Fossey," or "Bubby, Buckle, Budsy, Buffers, Bugdorf." Lucas Carney's was the stupidest, I thought, because a lot of the people's names sounded the same even though they were spelled different. His was Carr, Carney, Car. When he said it, it sounded like he was stuttering or something. Me and Lucas hadn't seen each other for a while, but we ended up laughing about that. My own group was Monk, Muliker, Moon, Mutter, Mulrooney. I hadn't really known Ricky Muliker before graduation, but he turned out to be a pretty good guy, and the two of us messed around a lot at practice. Anyhow, on Saturday night before the ceremony, I finally started getting sort of excited about the whole thing. I must have tied my tie about 20 times before I got it just right. And I think I may have went a little overboard with the hair gel too. I don't know why, but the big events in your life just seem to require a little extra hold. Altogether, I had given out 5 invitations. Ma, Skelly, Aunt Margaret, James, and Mrs. Russell. Mrs. Russell was my mother's idea. She used the old Mrs. Russell loves you like a grandson routine on me. But the truth is, I'd been planning to invite her anyway. After all, it wasn't like I was going to have to sit next to her at the ceremony. And even though she'd be wearing a nurse's uniform, white's a popular color at graduations, so I figured she'd probably blend in with the normal people okay. At least that's what I thought before we picked her up that night. With Skelly in the back seat, my mother and I drove over to Mrs. Russell's house around 6 o'clock. We had just pulled up at the curb when she came out her front door. It looked like she was wearing a small mixing bowl on her head. I closed my eyes. Oh, no, 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 no. Ma leaned down and looked through my window. Good Lord in heaven, what is on her head? By this time, Mrs. Russell was already at the car. But instead of getting right in the back seat, she bent down next to the window and banged on the glass with her knuckles. Yoo-hoo! Hello, graduation boy! I turned and looked at my mother. Please just shoot me. Finally, Mrs. Russell opened the back door and slid in next to Skelly. Hello, Skelly, you big handsome fella, she said, giving him a hug. After that, she tapped on my head. Well, who's going to be the first one to compliment me on my new nurse's cap? I ordered it from the catalog especially for this occasion. It just came this morning, isn't it cute? It's called a pillbox hat. Get it? Ha Ma smiled. It's wonderful, Alma. Very stylish. Jake and I were just commenting on it. It's charming, isn't it, Jake? I made a noise and slumped lower in my seat. Thought maybe if I stayed below window level, no one would see me. Unfortunately, after picking up Mrs. Russell, there was still one more stop to make. Earlier, Aunt Margaret had called from work and said she'd be a little late, so she wanted us to pick up James. When we drove up his street, he was sitting in the yard waiting for us. He was wearing cut-off jeans and a t-shirt with the sleeves ripped out, and he was eating a corn dog. Also, since the last time I'd seen him, he'd gotten a nose ring. As soon as he opened the door, I looked over the seat at him. James, you understand we're on our way to a graduation, not WrestleMania, right? James faked a grin, and there was corn dogs stuck on his tooth. By the time we pulled into the school parking lot, I was slumped so far down in my seat I was on the floor almost. As soon as Ma stopped the car, I bailed right out and headed for the gym. Jake, wait! Don't I get a kiss? She called. I froze in my tracks. Perfect way to start things off. Your mother hollering for a smooch across a crowded parking lot. I sprinted back, pecked her on the cheek, and ran off again. When I was a safe enough distance away, I slowed to a stop and looked back. Ma was helping Skelly out of the car. He was wearing his brand new suit from Sears and his new red clip-on bow tie. He looked distinguished almost, like a retired doctor or a college professor or something. I watched from the sidewalk as Ma combed and then recombed his hair. Skelly held his head perfectly still while she made his part. After she finished, she put her hand real gentle on his cheek. She must have told him how handsome he looked because he started to smile. I smiled too a little and walked on. We'd gotten there in plenty of time for my mother to find seats near the door. It was important for her to be close to an exit in case Skelly got restless. In the meantime, I hung out with a bunch of the other kids who were early like me. It wasn't long, though, before the teachers started rounding us up to get in line. Like a lot of gyms, ours is a big square room with a door in each corner. Mrs. Rook, our school principal, had drilled it into our heads that when we walked in, we should keep the pace slow and dignified. Walk in time to the music. She must have told us that like a million times. We do not dance in time to the music, or stroll in time to the music, or mosey, or march, or strut in time to the music. She stopped here and searched the gym until she found Jerome Sheridan. She raised her voice a level. And above all, Jerome, my pet, we do not get down in time to the music. Everybody laughed, but it wasn't until the music started for real that night that I finally understood why she'd been so insistent that we walk. Graduation music sounds almost like church music when it's playing for real, so you don't really want a bunch of yahoos messing up the mood. When I started into the gym, my stomach was flip-flopping like you wouldn't believe. I kept my head down and concentrated on the backs of Ricky Mulliker's shoes. Somehow, I thankfully got to my seat without tripping. I relaxed a little then and looked in the bleachers for Ma. I stretched my neck every way I could, but there were too many heads in the way to see the bleachers near the door, so finally I just gave up trying. Maybe it was even better like this. Maybe if I couldn't see Skelly, I wouldn't be as nervous about him. Anyhow, it took a while for everyone to get settled, but at last Mrs. Rook, who was sitting with the other speakers on stage, stepped up to the microphone and began her welcome to graduation speech. Like with every principal I've ever known, whenever Mrs. Rook starts to talk, she promises not to blabber on forever, and then she blabbers on forever. Not only that, but at these graduation ceremonies, one blabberer is never enough. Like the man who came after Mrs. Rook. Some state senator or somebody. He talked twice as long as she did. And according to the program, we still hadn't even gotten to the official greetings from the president of the Board of Education. I sank down in my chair and closed my eyes. Ricky gave me an elbow in the ribs. Hey, Moon, what time is it? I held up my watch so he could see. It was 7:45. He rolled his head back in annoyance. Jeez, when is this guy going to button it up? My baby brother's never going to last. I shifted in my seat and wondered about Skelly. Finally, the president of the Board of Education stepped up to the microphone. He wanted to bid us a warm and gracious good evening, he said. Ricky Muliker groaned. How about a warm and gracious get off the stage, he grumbled back. I closed my eyes again and tried to relax. Unfortunately, even though I didn't know it at the time, at the other end of the gym, Ma was still waiting for Aunt Margaret to show up. My aunt had said she would be there by 7:15 at the latest, so by now my mother had started to panic. In her alarm, Ma sent Mrs. Russell outside to look for Margaret. You understood that part, right? Ma sent Mrs. Russell on a search mission. And so what do you know? Within minutes, Mrs. Russell was missing too. Now here's where the story really starts to get lively. My mother finally decided that she had no choice but to go find both of them. So she put James in charge of Skelly. You know James, corn dog tooth with the nose ring. And who knows, maybe it might have even worked out. Except that right after Ma left the gym, James spotted Aunt Margaret on the other side of the room. So my brilliant cousin told Skelly to stay put, and then he ran out the door, raced to the other side of the building, hollered to his mother to follow him, and then ran back to Skelly as fast as he could. But big surprise, Skelly was already gone. Or at least James thought he was gone. Only here comes another one of those twists like I mentioned at the beginning. Because except for James, everyone in the gymnasium knew exactly where Skelly was. Or as Ricky Muliker put it when he nudged me in the ribs again, Hey Moon, who's that old guy walking up the steps? My stomach heaved. When I looked up, Skelly had already reached the top of the stairs. Mrs. Rook nodded at him and smiled. She later admitted that she thought he was some retired bigwig sent from the superintendent's office looking for his seat. So as my grandfather carefully made his way around the chairs of dignitaries, no one said a word. Not even when he headed for the red and yellow paint ladders. I bent over in my chair and prayed, Oh, Jesus, please let Ma see him. Please just see him. The crash came next. Skelly had tried to lift one of the ladders and the books had fallen onto the floor. Uh-oh! Uh-oh! He yelled out. Instantly, 2 security guards rushed up the stairs and grabbed him. Skelly hollered in surprise. He raised his head then and saw the audience, and I honestly don't think that until that very moment, he'd even been aware that they were there. Seconds later, my grandfather hid his head in the sleeve of his new suit from Sears, and he started to cry. I still don't remember running onto the stage that night. I do remember tripping when I went up the steps, though. Somehow I caught myself and kept going. Skelly heard the noise and looked over. I slowed down and forced myself to walk. Shh, Skelly. Shh. It's okay. I promise it is. Everything's fine. Skelly looked at my face. He didn't have a clue who I was. Come on, Skell, you know me. Don't let the hair gel fool you, okay? Look at my face again. See? It's me. It's just... I paused. It's Claude Harper. As soon as he heard the name, his shoulders relaxed a little. Claude Harper, he repeated softly. By then, I was right next to him. I put my arm around his waist. Yeah, Skell, it's Claude, and here's what I'm thinking, okay? I'm thinking that maybe you and I should go right over there to those steps. See them over there? I pointed. What do you say, You want to walk over to those steps with me? I kept my arm around his waist, and the two of us started to walk. His feet shuffled heavily as if he were suddenly tired. We just took it slow. When we got to the end of the stage, Ma and Aunt Margaret were waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Skelly and I went carefully down. They took his hands and led him away. I got my diploma just a little while later. The walk to the stage was a lot tougher the second time. I just kept my eyes glued on Ricky's shoes again and tried to block out all the whispers from the audience. When Mrs. Rook finally called my name, James whistled so loud from the audience that she actually laughed. And as she handed me my diploma, She shook my hand and held it extra long. She said I should be very proud. I don't think she was talking about school stuff. After that, I walked down the steps and out the gym door and just kept on going till I got to the car. It was locked, but the rest of them were there within minutes. I hugged Ma first, then everyone else. Except James, of course. We'd talk about this later and forever, probably. But right now, I just wanted to go home. I got in the back seat, and Skelly slid in beside me, and I held his hand. As Ma pulled out of the parking lot, I rolled down the window and breathed in the cool air. My shoulders loosened up a little. Next to me, Skelly sighed. I smiled at him in the dark and looked out into the night sky. In my mind, I could almost hear him whispering, "Attaboy, Jake. Attaboy." And that is the end of Barbara Park's story, The Graduation of Jake Moon. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and boy, what a moment at the end with Jake running up on the stage to help Skelly at his graduation ceremony. And if you think about the way Jake was at the beginning of the story, I don't think he would have gone up to help him if Skelly hadn't gotten lost. If you remember, just in that simple scene at the dumpster, he wouldn't even speak up for his grandfather, let alone doing it in front of 500 of his classmates and who knows how many hundreds, possibly thousands of family members of these other students. But after Skelly got lost and then they found him again, I think Jake finally realized that he had been taking Skelly for granted. He had been frustrated with the disease and all of the hardship that had brought, and he was understandably really down about how things had been the last few years. His grandfather losing his ability to think clearly and even have simple conversations or even recognize his own family. All of the things that Jake had to miss out on, it was rough on him, no question. But he was taking all of that anger out on Skelly when it wasn't really Skelly's fault. He can't control that. He didn't choose to get Alzheimer's. He didn't do anything wrong. It just happened. But then Jake realized he's been taking it for granted, and he appreciates the fact that Skelly's at least still around for now. And I think that helped him realize he had been so worried about what other people thought, he hadn't really been putting his family first. But a really nice moment for Jake at the end, running up to help Skelly. And hopefully you enjoyed this story, and if you did, feel free to check out some of Barbara Park's other works. Like we mentioned in our first video, she's a legendary children's author, the writer of all the Junie B. Jones books. But she's got plenty of other stuff out there that takes a little more serious tone, kind of like The Graduation of Jake Moon. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Check out other Read Aloud videos and other videos on our channel, and have a good one. Bye.